Everyone laughed at the cleaning lady in cheap clothes, but when the millionaire came to do an inspection, everyone was shocked. The early morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow through the towering glass windows of the office building. Inside, the world was still quiet, save for the rhythmic sound of a mop swishing across the polished floor. Clara moved with purpose, her worn-out sneakers squeaking slightly as she wiped down the glass windows with a cloth that had seen better days. Dressed in a plain, faded uniform, one that had certainly seen its share of laundry days, she blended into the background, almost invisible amidst the sleek modernity of the office. Each desk gleamed with newly arrived laptops, each chair was plush, and the artificial plants along the windowsill stood perfectly arranged. In contrast, Clara's uniform was simple, practical, and far from the refined image the office staff so proudly wore. Outside the circle of polished suits and crisp white shirts, she was a ghost, invisible and often dismissed. The high-end shoes of employees echoed as they walked past her, their eyes gliding over her without pause. Clara didn't mind. She was here to work, and work was what she did best. As the office slowly filled with the hum of activity, the rush of busy professionals clad in designer attire created a sharp contrast to Clara's humble appearance. She continued her work without fanfare, dusting desks, wiping down the windows, and scrubbing away the remnants of the previous night's work. Each task was done with precision. The air hummed with the rhythm of the office, but Clara remained a quiet, constant presence in the background. Her movements focused and deliberate, unperturbed by the glossy world surrounding her. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the workday, the office transformed into a flurry of business transactions, meetings, and energy. But Clara's quiet demeanor remained unchanged. She worked, as she always had, with dignity. As the clock struck 8:30 a.m., the office was buzzing with activity. Employees streamed in, all dressed in the latest business fashion: tailored suits, sleek dresses, and polished shoes. Clara, still focused on her cleaning, remained unnoticed in the corner of the room, as she had every morning. But today was different. The employees, already settled at their desks, whispered and giggled behind their hands as Clara moved about. The muffled chatter grew louder as they passed her, their words thinly veiled in the busy office atmosphere. "Can you believe she still wears that same old uniform?" one of the junior assistants muttered, eyeing Clara from her desk. "I mean, it's so cheap." The remark wasn't meant to be heard, but Clara couldn't help but catch it. She pretended not to notice, continuing her work as if nothing had been said. From the other side of the office, a senior manager whispered to his colleague, "She'll never fit in with us. Look at her clothes. It's like she's stuck in a time warp." Clara's hand froze for just a second as she wiped the counter, but then she resumed her task, her expression unreadable. She could feel the eyes of the office staff on her, judging, scrutinizing. Yet she didn't flinch. A few desks away, Melissa, a well-groomed and self-assured office manager, rolled her eyes as Clara walked past with her cleaning cart. Melissa leaned back in her chair, speaking just loud enough for Clara to hear. "Some people just don't know how to dress for success." The comment was direct, an insult that Clara could not avoid. But again, Clara didn't acknowledge it. Instead, she adjusted her cleaning cloth, moving efficiently to the next task, her quiet dignity refusing to crumble under the weight of their judgment. The laughter and whispers continued, but Clara's focus never wavered. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to do her job, nothing more, nothing less. As the office filled with the noise of phones ringing, emails being sent, and papers shuffling, Clara remained a quiet observer of the morning chaos. Her work was methodical, each task performed with precision. She dusted, wiped, and cleaned with the same quiet dedication she always brought to her job. The whispers and mockery around her didn't faze her. If anything, they seemed distant, as though they came from another world entirely. Inside Clara's mind, the noise of the office faded into the background. She didn't need their validation. She knew her worth wasn't tied to her appearance, her uniform, or the judgment of others. As she moved around the office, carefully organizing cleaning supplies and picking up stray pieces of trash, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She had learned long ago not to let the opinions of others shape her. Clara had grown up with little, always working hard to support herself and her family. Her childhood had taught her one thing: work was a form of pride. It didn't matter if others looked down on her. What mattered was doing her best and taking pride in her efforts. There was something deeply symbolic about how Clara worked. Each wipe of the desk, each sweep of the floor, represented not just physical cleanliness but inner discipline. As she carefully arranged cleaning supplies in their designated spots, there was a certain grace in the way she handled each object, a quiet respect for her tools and her work. And yet, despite the quiet focus of her movements, Clara wasn't oblivious to the world around her. She had seen the looks, heard the whispers, and felt the sting of judgment. But none of that changed her. She remained grounded in her humility, and that was her strength. In the vast open-plan office, the hierarchy was unmistakable. At the top were the senior executives, sharp, confident, always impeccably dressed. Their decisions shaped the future of the company. Then there were the middle managers, like Melissa, who carried a certain arrogance with them, believing they were the backbone of the organization, capable of commanding the respect of the lower-level employees. And then there was Clara, the cleaner, who existed somewhere on the fringe of the office's social structure, never really seen but always present. Clara's interactions with Melissa, the office manager, were limited to a few brief moments each day, usually when Melissa would storm past her in her designer heels, too busy to even acknowledge her existence. However, when she did interact with Clara, it was with a tone of superiority, almost as if Clara's very presence was beneath her. "Don't forget to clean up the break room today," Melissa would say, her words sharp, not a hint of gratitude in her voice. She would then walk off, leaving Clara to finish the task without any acknowledgement of the work that went into it. Melissa's disdain for Clara wasn't hidden. It was clear in the way she looked at her, the way she treated her like a fixture of the office, like a thing rather than a person. But it wasn't just Melissa. The entire office operated with an unspoken code that Clara was not part of. The senior employees and even many of the mid-level managers barely acknowledged her, as though she were invisible to them. When she passed by their desks, they didn't make eye contact, didn't offer a smile. To them, she was a part of the background, the person they paid no attention to, the worker whose only role was to clean up after them. Clara didn't mind. She had learned long ago to work in silence, to go unnoticed. But inside it always stung a little. As the day unfolded, the tension in the office seemed to grow thicker. The employees, already swarming with the usual busy work, added a layer of whispered judgment to their routine. Clara, as usual, moved quietly through the office, but it was clear that she was becoming the subject of more and more subtle jabs. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Melissa and a few other employees gathering around a nearby desk, laughing. When Clara passed by, one of them, a junior accountant named Sarah, flicked her eyes over to Clara's worn shoes, then exchanged a look with Melissa. "She can't even keep her shoes in good condition," Sarah said in a stage whisper, just loud enough for Clara to hear. The words, though casual, were designed to sting, to remind Clara of the difference between them, of their power and her insignificance. Clara didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm and neutral, her steps purposeful as she moved on to the next task. But deep down there was a flicker of hurt. She didn't understand why people felt the need to belittle her, to make her the punchline of their jokes. It wasn't as if she wanted to be invisible, but she had long since resigned herself to the role she played in the office. Later that day, as Clara walked into the break room to empty the trash, she saw David, a middle manager who had always treated her with indifference, look at her with an expression of mild annoyance. "Clara, did you finish the bathrooms yet? The clients will be using them soon," he said. His voice clipped. Clara nodded, her heart sinking. It wasn't the request. It was the way he said it, as though she were barely competent enough to handle the most menial tasks. She was so used to this treatment by now that it barely affected her on the surface, but it still stung. She had tried to be friendly with some of them, but they never seemed interested in reciprocating. They saw her as a cleaner, not someone worthy of conversation. Clara's value in their eyes was tied to her role, not who she was or what she could offer. The office was an ecosystem of exclusivity, and everyone seemed to know their place. The employees prided themselves on their elite status, often speaking in subtle, yet pointed ways that reinforced their superiority. They discussed expensive lunches, exotic vacations, and the latest designer trends with the ease of those who had never known a day without them. It was as though wealth and status were not just visible but expected, like an unspoken currency that everyone had to partake in. Clara watched them from her quiet corner, never once contributing to the conversations. The clinking of coffee cups, the soft rustle of paperwork, and the background hum of office chatter blended into a dull monotony that had long since lost its relevance to her. She had no desire to join in, no interest in the high-end lifestyle they bragged about. What did their holidays in Monaco or their private golf club outings matter to her? They were just words, empty and hollow like the people who spoke them. As the employees gathered around the coffee machine one morning, Clara overheard a conversation that seemed especially designed to make her feel inferior. "I heard Melissa got a new designer handbag," one of the assistants said with a note of admiration in her voice. "You know, the one everyone's talking about. It's so exclusive." Another chimed in, "I can't even afford a decent jacket, let alone something like that." The conversation lingered for a while, growing louder as they compared the price tags of various luxuries. Clara didn't interrupt. She simply busied herself with wiping the counters. But inside, a quiet resentment began to simmer. They didn't even try to hide it anymore, their complete lack of regard for anyone who wasn't as privileged as they were. And yet Clara wasn't fazed. Her mind was elsewhere, centered on the task she had to complete, on the things that mattered to her. She wasn't bothered by the fact that she wasn't part of their conversations or their world. In truth, she was at peace with that. There was a strength in her quiet rejection of their need to elevate themselves above others. It wasn't just pride, it was clarity. A brief moment of solitude came later, when Clara sat at her desk during a break, looking out the window. The sky was overcast, the office courtyard below eerily quiet. Clara let out a breath, gathering her thoughts. The office, with all its pretensions, felt so distant. It was a world she wasn't a part of, but then maybe that was for the best. She had something much stronger, her own sense of worth. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the news spread like wildfire through the office. Mr. Bennet, the wealthy investor who held a significant stake in the company, was coming for an inspection. This was not just any visit. It was the visit that everyone had been dreading, yet secretly anticipating. The atmosphere in the office shifted almost instantly, as though the entire building held its breath. The employees, once casually going about their daily tasks, suddenly sprung into action. Desks were cleared of clutter, papers were straightened, and any signs of disorder were swiftly swept under the rug. There was an undeniable air of nervous energy that filled the space. Everyone was on edge, from the junior assistants to the senior managers, who were now hastily checking their attire in the mirrors of the bathrooms, adjusting their collars and reapplying cologne. Melissa led the charge, moving quickly from one end of the office to the other. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, and her face was set in a determined expression. She stopped in front of Clara, almost as an afterthought, but still with a certain haughty edge to her voice. "Clara, make sure the break room is spotless. And don't forget the bathrooms," she said, her tone betraying no sense of urgency. It was more of an order than a request, as if Clara's task was just another item on the long list of things to do before Mr. Bennet's arrival. Clara, however, didn't react. She simply nodded and got to work. While the staff scurried about in a panic to present their best selves, Clara remained unfazed. Her work ethic had always been constant, regardless of who was watching. She had done this job well for years, and this would be no different. There was no need for her to participate in the frenzy. The preparation, the primping, the scrambling, it didn't concern her. What bothered her, though, was the way the others seemed to think their worth was tied to how they appeared before Mr. Bennet. Their anxiety seemed to be born of a belief that wealth and status were the only things that mattered. Clara knew better. The office was buzzing with an energy that was far from the usual hum of routine. The walls, which were often quiet and sterile, now seemed to hum with an underlying tension. Melissa and her colleagues scrambled to ensure every corner of the office was spotless. Every report was perfectly organized. They rearranged papers, polished desk lamps, and even fluffed cushions on the chairs in the waiting area. There was no detail too small to overlook. Sarah, the assistant, was wiping the windows for the third time, muttering to herself about how Mr. Bennet preferred everything immaculate. David, the middle manager, kept glancing at his watch and then at the entrance, nervously checking his tie for the 100th time. The workers who usually lounged in the break room were now hustling between desks, acting like they were engaged in the most urgent of tasks. It was a frenzy of superficial productivity. Everyone was desperate to impress the billionaire. The tension was palpable, and Clara, in the middle of all of it, continued with her usual methodical work. She wiped down the counters, organized cleaning supplies, and emptied trash cans, as though the chaos around her didn't even touch her. She was calm, focused. Her role might have been to keep the office clean, but in this moment, it felt like the chaos was something entirely separate from her. As the others prepared for Mr. Bennet's arrival, they spoke in hushed tones about the pressure they were under. "Do you think he'll even notice if we mess up?" one employee asked nervously. Another, with a flicker of disdain, replied, "It's not about whether he notices. It's about making sure we don't look incompetent in front of him. If we screw this up, we could all be out of a job." Clara overheard them but didn't let their words affect her. She was just cleaning, just doing her job, but she couldn't ignore the subtle, growing tension around her. It wasn't just the fear of an inspection, it was the fear of judgment, of being exposed for not measuring up. Clara knew this pressure all too well. She had lived it every day, just in a different form. As the office buzzed with frantic preparation, Clara couldn't help but observe the absurdity of it all. The employees, consumed with their image and the need to appear flawless before Mr. Bennet, had turned the office into a stage. Everything, from the papers on their desks to the polish on their shoes, was an act of presentation. Clara, on the other hand, remained an invisible thread in the fabric of the office. A cleaner, a worker, someone whose presence went unnoticed unless she was needed to scrub a countertop or empty a trash can. But today there was something different in the air. Clara felt a subtle shift, a tension that wasn't just about the looming inspection but about something else, something unspoken. It wasn't until the moment she overheard a conversation between two employees that the reality of the situation hit her. "Mr. Bennet likes to be thorough. He's not impressed by appearances, but by results. I heard he's very focused on how the company is managed at every level," one of the junior accountants said. Clara paused, a brief flash of recognition in her eyes. She had heard this before, but today it meant something else entirely. It was no longer just idle chatter. It was a reminder of something she had kept to herself for so long, the truth that the employees were not aware of. With a small, knowing smile, Clara turned to a colleague as she passed by. "I guess Mr. Bennet won't mind if the bathrooms are clean. I'm sure he'll appreciate that, just like my father does." The words slipped out so naturally, so casually, that the colleague, Elaine, a quiet assistant, almost didn't hear her. But as Clara continued past, she realized the weight of what had just been said. Clara's father, the owner of the company, was in fact Mr. Bennet's partner. The realization hit like a thunderclap. Clara hadn't wanted to tell anyone. She had deliberately hidden her identity for years, unwilling to use her family's wealth or status to gain any advantages. But in this moment, she couldn't help herself. The truth had slipped out, and now, it was hanging in the air like an unanswered question. Elaine stared after Clara, eyes wide, as if seeing her for the first time. Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to. The moment Mr. Bennet walked through the doors of the office, the atmosphere shifted again. This time, in a way that was far more profound than any of the frantic preparations that had come before. The employees, once in motion, froze for a split second, as if the air had thickened and time had slowed down. Mr. Bennet was not what anyone had expected. He was tall, with a sharp, composed demeanor, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. He didn't carry the aura of a man accustomed to being flattered. His crisp, tailored suit and polished shoes were understated, elegant in their simplicity, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were calm, unyielding, yet seemed to see through everything around him. There was no grand entrance, no entourage following behind him. He wasn't there to be impressed by surface-level niceties or the employees' manicured appearances. He was there for something deeper. As he walked past the rows of desks, the employees stiffened, some adjusting their posture, others trying to hide their unease behind forced smiles. Melissa, who had been bustling around earlier in a panic, now stood frozen in place, her eyes wide and expectant. Mr. Bennet's gaze swept over the office with little regard for the gleaming desks or the shiny shoes. He was looking for something else, something more genuine. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, Mr. Bennet's gaze locked onto Clara. She was cleaning a corner of the office, just like she always did. She hadn't looked up when he entered. She didn't feel the need to. In that moment, Clara's presence seemed to stand in stark contrast to the rest of the office. Unhurried, focused, calm. Mr. Bennet's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than anyone expected, and as he continued his walk, the employees exchanged confused looks. They had expected him to be drawn to their polished efforts, their perfect displays of competence. But his attention had gravitated toward Clara, the cleaner. After a few more moments of walking through the office, Mr. Bennet finally made his way over to Clara. The employees watched with bated breath, unsure of what was happening. The hum of the office had shifted into a hushed silence, the earlier frenzy of preparation forgotten. It was almost as if Clara was the center of attention now, even though she hadn't made a single effort to stand out. Clara, who had been dusting the shelves quietly, finally looked up as Mr. Bennet approached her. He didn't seem in a hurry. His expression was calm, his demeanor completely unpretentious. "How's your day going?" Mr. Bennet asked, his voice low but steady, almost casual, as if they were two equals exchanging pleasantries. The employees stared, shocked by the way he addressed her, not with the cold detachment of someone accustomed to power, but with genuine curiosity. Clara, though surprised by his attention, responded just as calmly, as if this were no different from any other moment in her daily routine. "It's going well, thank you. I've just finished cleaning up for the morning." For a moment, Mr. Bennet simply nodded. He looked at her carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he were evaluating her in a way that had nothing to do with appearances. The employees exchanged glances, all of them wondering why he was spending so much time with the cleaning lady. Was he confused? Was he just being polite? Then, in a quiet voice that only Clara could hear, Mr. Bennet said, "I've been watching you, you know. I've heard a lot about your work ethic." Clara didn't flinch. She simply gave a small nod, not revealing anything about how this conversation was making her feel. But there was something in Mr. Bennet's tone that was different now, an underlying respect. The others watched, feeling the weight of the words between them, but not understanding what was unfolding before them. It was only then that Clara dropped the bombshell. "You know," she said casually, "my father is actually the owner of the company." The words landed like a slap, reverberating in the quiet space. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had frozen. The office was silent. "Your father?" Mr. Bennet asked, raising an eyebrow, his voice cool but with a hint of intrigue. "Yes," Clara replied, almost absent-mindedly. "He's a self-made millionaire, and this company is his legacy." The words Clara had just spoken hung in the air like a cloud of tension. The employees, who had been quietly observing from their desks, went still. Melissa's face, which had been a mask of polite interest, now betrayed a flicker of disbelief. She glanced at her colleagues, then back to Clara, as if trying to process what had just been revealed. Clara's words had shattered the carefully constructed image everyone had of her. They had spent years treating her like an invisible part of the office, someone to be ignored, dismissed, and underestimated. But now, with that single statement, Clara had revealed that she was not just the cleaning lady. She was the daughter of the very man they had all been so desperate to impress. For a moment, the office was plunged into an uncomfortable silence. No one dared to speak. their minds racing as they tried to piece together the implications of what Clara had just dropped into their laps. Mr. Bennet, however, was unfazed. He took a moment to look at Clara, his gaze steady, not with shock or surprise, but with a sense of understanding. "Your father is a great man," he said quietly. "I've always respected him. And I can see the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." The office staff was still processing his words when he turned his attention to the others, his presence suddenly commanding the space. But for the first time that morning, the employees weren't focused on how they appeared or whether they were impressing him. They were now watching Clara. Their eyes had opened, finally seeing her for what she truly was. Not just a cleaner, not just an invisible figure in the background, but someone with strength, dignity, and quiet power. As Mr. Bennet moved on to other parts of the office, the shift in perception was undeniable. Melissa and the others, who had been so quick to judge Clara based on her clothes, now stood there, fully aware of the colossal mistake they had made. The realization hit hard, and they knew, deep down, that they had underestimated her, misjudged her, and perhaps even humiliated her without ever knowing who she really was. As soon as Mr. Bennet left the room, the office erupted into an awkward, disjointed buzz. The employees exchanged glances, their minds whirling as they processed the revelation that Clara was the daughter of the company's owner. The atmosphere, once tense and anxious with anticipation, had shifted into something far more uncomfortable. Shame, guilt, and disbelief hovered over them like an invisible cloud. Melissa stood in the middle of the office, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting from one colleague to the next. She looked like she had been caught in a lie, but she couldn't quite figure out how to unravel the truth. The realization that she had spent so many years judging someone who could have been her equal, if not more, hit her like a wave. Some employees tried to maintain their composure, but their unease was visible. Whispers began to circulate. "She's the daughter. How did we not know?" Some faces turned red with embarrassment, while others looked downright panicked. The arrogance and assumptions that had once colored their interactions with Clara were now replaced by regret and shame. But Clara, she remained completely calm, unaffected by the chaos around her. She simply continued with her work, wiping down her cleaning supplies, her expression composed and serene. If she was bothered by the revelation or by the sudden change in how she was being perceived, it didn't show. While the others floundered in their own discomfort, Clara carried on, like nothing had changed. And, in a way, nothing had. She had always been the same person she was before the revelation. It was the others who had changed. Melissa approached Clara tentatively, her face painted with guilt. "Clara, sorry. I had no idea who you were," she stammered, her voice laced with remorse. I treated you poorly. I was wrong." Clara didn't respond immediately, instead glancing up from her work. "It's okay," she said softly, her tone gentle but firm. "But remember, it's never too late to treat others with respect." Clara's words were simple, but they carried weight. As Melissa stood there, apologizing for her previous behavior, Clara gave her a small, understanding smile, then returned to her work. There was no need for grand speeches, no need for dramatic confrontation. Clara wasn't interested in making anyone feel worse than they already did. Instead, her focus was on something far more important: teaching a lesson that would stick. Judging others by their appearance or what they wear doesn't tell you anything about who they are. Clara continued softly, her voice steady. It only shows what you choose to see. The rest of the office had fallen silent as they watched this exchange. Melissa was now standing awkwardly in front of Clara, her earlier arrogance replaced by a genuine desire to understand. She had expected Clara to be angry or confrontational, but instead she was met with a quiet dignity that only deepened her embarrassment. Clara paused in her work and looked directly at her. "I've been here for a long time. I've seen people come and go. But what I've learned is that the most important thing isn't what people wear or what they drive. It's about what they do, how they treat others. That's what defines a person." Melissa's face softened, her eyes welling up with a mix of shame and understanding. The lesson was clear. Clara was not interested in playing games or holding grudges. She was above the petty dynamics of office politics. "Thank you for saying that," Melissa whispered, her voice shaking slightly. I have a lot to think about." Clara nodded and continued her work, not expecting an apology or a grand gesture. She simply believed in the power of humility and the importance of empathy, lessons she had learned through years of being quietly overlooked and underestimated. As the employees looked on, they began to feel the weight of their own actions, the reality of how they had treated Clara coming to the forefront. Her quiet wisdom was something none of them had expected from the woman they had so carelessly dismissed. The days that followed Clara's revelation were strange for everyone. The office, once filled with a hum of mundane chatter and quiet judgment, now held an air of reflective quiet. Employees like Melissa started to act with newfound humility, though their actions felt somewhat awkward and tentative at first. The old dynamic was slowly shifting, but it was clear that the change would take time. It wasn't just Melissa who began to act differently. Small shifts could be seen across the office. People who had once rushed past Clara with barely a nod now stopped to exchange a greeting. The harsh whispers and dismissive glances that had followed her wherever she went were replaced by quiet respect. Melissa, who had once been one of the loudest voices in the office, now made a conscious effort to engage with Clara in a way that acknowledged her worth. Not because Clara was the daughter of the company owner, but because she was a kind, dignified woman who deserved respect, just like anyone else. The sharp, condescending remarks that used to fly between the employees had all but stopped. Instead, there were apologies, some quiet, others spoken with sincerity. One afternoon, Clara was on her break, sitting quietly by the window. As she sipped her tea, she overheard a conversation between a couple of employees, including Melissa. This time it was different. There was no gossip or mockery. Instead, Melissa was talking about the importance of humility, sharing lessons she had learned from Clara. "I never realized how wrong I was," Melissa was saying. "It's easy to think someone's life is simple because of what they wear or how they carry themselves. But it's what's on the inside that counts." Clara smiled to herself, feeling the weight of that small moment. It wasn't about being right, it was about helping others to see the value in things that had been hidden before. The respect that was now starting to grow in the office felt authentic. Slowly, people were learning to treat one another with kindness and understanding, no longer blinded by preconceived judgments. Though the office dynamics had shifted, Clara remained the same, humble, hardworking, and dedicated to her role. But now, there was a deep, unspoken recognition that her worth was far beyond what anyone had once imagined. Weeks passed, and the office continued to evolve. The tension from Mr. Bennet's visit had started to fade, but the impact of his words, along with Clara's quiet wisdom, lingered. The employees were different now, more respectful, more thoughtful. But there was one last, unexpected twist to come. One morning, as Clara was finishing her cleaning duties, she was called into Mr. Bennet's office. Her heart skipped a beat. She had no idea why she was being summoned, but she had learned long ago not to fear the unknown. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked into the office, her demeanor as calm and composed as ever. Mr. Bennet was seated at his desk, looking over some papers. He looked up when Clara entered, his expression unreadable. "Clara, thank you for coming," he said, his voice warm but businesslike. She nodded, standing in front of him with quiet dignity. "I've been thinking," Mr. Bennet continued, folding his hands in front of him, "about how well you handled yourself during the inspection. You exhibited something that's hard to find in this business: humility, and a true understanding of what matters." Clara said nothing, though a small, appreciative smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She didn't know where this conversation was going, but she could sense something important was coming. "I've been watching you for some time now," Mr. Bennet went on. "I've been impressed by your work ethic, your professionalism, and how you've handled the dynamics in the office. I think it's time that we recognize your abilities in a more official capacity." Clara blinked, surprised, but said nothing. Mr. Bennet leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I'd like to offer you a position in the company, something more than just cleaning. You have the skills and the mindset to be much more. How would you feel about stepping into a managerial role?" The offer was nothing short of a shock. Clara had never expected this. She had always believed that her place was humble, but in that moment, she saw the truth of what Mr. Bennet was offering. An opportunity not based on appearances, but on merit and respect. The news of Clara's new position spread like wildfire throughout the office. It wasn't just that she had been offered a promotion, it was the sheer shock of it all. Employees who had once dismissed Clara as just the cleaner now found themselves confronted with a new reality. She had been the one with the true worth all along, even when they hadn't seen it. At first, the reactions were mixed. Some employees, like Melissa, who had been particularly harsh, felt a deep sense of regret. Melissa had been the one to treat Clara with the most disdain, dismissing her presence in the office like she was nothing more than a ghost. Now, she found herself confronting the very woman she had mocked, feeling an overwhelming wave of shame. She couldn't help but replay her past behavior over and over in her mind. How could she have been so blind? In the break room, Melissa hesitated before approaching Clara. Her hands fidgeted with the cup she was holding as she stepped toward Clara, who was sipping her coffee, her face relaxed but alert. "Clara, I just wanted to say," Melissa began, trailing off as if unsure of how to begin. Clara looked up at her, still calm as ever, her expression kind. "I'm sorry," Melissa continued, her voice cracking a little. "I was wrong about you. I treated you terribly, and I've been thinking about it a lot. I don't know how I could have missed it. You're incredible. You always were." Clara smiled softly, her eyes gentle. "It's okay, Melissa," she said quietly. "It's never too late to change, and I appreciate your apology. But I hope that going forward, you'll remember that we all deserve to be seen for who we truly are, not just what others assume." The sincerity in her words hit Melissa hard. The realization was now clear to her. She had been so focused on outward appearances, so obsessed with status, that she had missed the very things that mattered most. As the days passed, more employees approached Clara to express their apologies, some of them still hesitant, others more direct. Clara accepted each one with grace. Her quiet strength the true measure of her character. The office was different now, not just in how the employees treated Clara, but in how they approached their work. The shift in dynamics was palpable. Respect had replaced the silent tension, and camaraderie had begun to blossom in the most unlikely places. Even those who had been reluctant to change, like Melissa, were slowly beginning to see the truth in Clara's words. They no longer saw her as just the cleaning lady, but as an integral part of the company. Someone who, despite her modest beginnings, had an undeniable strength and vision that far surpassed their initial assumptions. Clara, for her part, remained as humble as ever. She had never sought the spotlight. In fact, she hadn't expected any recognition at all. But as she sat at her new desk in the corner of the office, now part of the managerial team, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. It wasn't in the title or the recognition. Those things had never mattered to her. What mattered was that she was respected for who she truly was. Her first meeting as a new manager was a quiet success. The staff, though still a bit apprehensive, followed her lead. Clara listened carefully to everyone's ideas and offered solutions that were practical and thoughtful. Her calm demeanor, her ability to listen, and her unwavering commitment to doing things the right way were qualities that made her stand out. Her approach wasn't based on power or authority. It was based on collaboration and genuine respect for others. By the end of the meeting, even the most skeptical employees, like Melissa, were nodding in agreement. They were beginning to understand something important. Leadership wasn't about titles or the clothes you wore. It was about your ability to make others feel valued, your commitment to the task at hand, and your unwavering integrity. As Clara walked back to her office after the meeting, she felt a wave of peace. She had come full circle, not by trying to prove anything to anyone, but simply by being herself. In doing so, she had shown the office the power of quiet strength, humility, and respect. The weeks following Clara's promotion passed with a sense of gradual transformation, both in her and in the office. Clara's new managerial role was challenging, yes, but it was also a natural fit. Her skills in organization, her keen eye for detail, and most importantly, her humble leadership style, quickly set her apart as an effective and compassionate leader. Mr. Bennet's faith in her abilities wasn't misplaced. He had been watching her closely, not for her past, but for her potential. In fact, Clara's promotion wasn't just a gesture of recognition. It was a strategic move to bring balance and harmony to the office. Under her leadership, the office dynamics shifted from competition and division to collaboration and trust. Despite her new responsibilities, Clara remained grounded. She still walked through the halls with the same modest grace, her presence never demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore. She didn't need to assert her authority because her quiet strength spoke volumes. Her colleagues began to see the beauty of this approach. It wasn't about who shouted the loudest or who wore the most expensive clothes. It was about integrity, commitment, and doing the work with sincerity. In her first month as a manager, Clara held a small meeting with her team. The employees, many of whom had once mocked her, now respected her opinions. Melissa, who had been particularly dismissive in the past, was the first to congratulate Clara on her new role. She couldn't help but smile, knowing how far she had come in her understanding of Clara's true worth. "I think we're lucky to have you, Clara," Melissa said with genuine warmth. Clara simply nodded, offering a small, knowing smile. "Thank you, Melissa. We're all in this together." The office had become a place of growth, not only in terms of business success, but in personal transformation as well. Clara's quiet influence was being felt by everyone. Employees were beginning to appreciate each other's strengths, respect each other's differences, and work toward a common goal. Clara was the invisible thread holding it all together, and her impact was undeniable. As Clara's influence grew stronger within the office, a deep sense of regret began to surface among the employees who had once mocked her. For Melissa and others like her, it was impossible to ignore the fact that Clara had quietly, yet decisively, proven herself far more capable than they had ever imagined. The realization hung in the air, unspoken but felt by all. They had misjudged her. At lunch, Melissa found herself sitting across from a few colleagues who had once laughed at Clara, gossiping about her clothes and dismissing her as nothing more than a cleaner. Now, those same colleagues were silent, their gazes shifting uneasily toward Clara's office, which they had once assumed was little more than a place for her to sweep the floors. They couldn't help but feel guilty. They had underestimated the quiet force of nature that Clara was. "I can't believe I treated her that way," Kelly, another employee, said softly, stirring her salad absent-mindedly. "She's a completely different person than I thought." "I know," Melissa murmured. "I made fun of her. Thought she was just some cleaning lady." But now, her voice trailed off as she watched Clara walking past the open door of the break room. Her head held high, a quiet aura of confidence surrounding her. "She's not just the cleaner anymore," Kelly continued, her voice full of newfound respect. "She's the one holding everything together. You can see it in how she works with everyone. She doesn't need to say much, she just gets it." Melissa nodded, swallowing her embarrassment. "I've never felt more foolish in my life. And the worst part is I think Clara knew. She knew all along." There was a quiet truth in those words. Clara had never needed their validation. Her character was built on her own self-respect, not on how others perceived her. But it didn't mean the shame they felt wasn't real. Stung. And perhaps, in some ways, that was the lesson they needed the most. As the months passed, Clara's role within the company solidified, and with it, her reputation. She had become an integral part of the office, not just in her managerial capacity but in the hearts of those who had once dismissed her. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't rely on grand gestures or loud declarations. Clara had never sought attention or recognition. It had all come naturally because she had remained true to herself, her values, and her work ethic. Her relationship with her colleagues shifted dramatically. The same people who had once judged her based on her appearance were now asking for her advice, seeking her counsel, and respecting her opinions. Even Melissa, who had been the most vocal in her earlier judgments, had transformed into one of Clara's most loyal supporters. She often went out of her way to offer help or simply to express gratitude for the lessons Clara had taught her, both professionally and personally. In her new role, Clara wasn't just managing office tasks. She was guiding the team through challenges, fostering a collaborative spirit, and encouraging personal growth. The work environment had changed for the better. No longer was there tension or rivalry, but a sense of unity, respect, and shared purpose. One morning, Clara stood by the large windows of her office, gazing out at the city below. The office, now humming with activity and productivity, reflected the transformation she had experienced. The once dismissive colleagues who had disregarded her based on the clothes she wore were now following her lead, inspired by her quiet strength and her capacity for empathy. Clara had proven that a person's worth wasn't defined by their appearance, their background, or their financial status. It was defined by the way they treated others, the integrity with which they worked, and the quiet courage to be themselves. As Clara looked out over the city, a gentle smile crossed her face. She had come a long way, farther than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. And the best part was, she had done it on her own terms. Months after Clara's rise from cleaning lady to manager, her presence in the office continued to inspire not just the employees, but the entire company culture. The transformation wasn't just visible on the surface. It had begun to seep into the very fabric of the organization. The atmosphere had become less about titles and appearances and more about the quality of the work and the spirit of collaboration. People no longer cared about who wore the finest clothes or who had the most prestigious job title. What mattered now was how you treated others, how you contributed to the collective success of the team, and the humility with which you approached challenges. The company had grown, its profits soaring, but it wasn't just the numbers that reflected success. The real achievement was the emotional shift within the office. What had once been a group of disconnected individuals was now a united team, built on mutual respect and shared values. Melissa, once the office's most condescending employee, had become a model of humility and hard work. She was often seen collaborating with others, offering a helping hand without a second thought. Clara's new role as a manager had brought about real changes, but her influence reached beyond the walls of the office. During a company retreat, Clara was invited to give a talk on leadership and personal growth. It was the first time she had addressed the entire company in such a formal setting, and as she stood before her colleagues, Clara felt the weight of the moment. But instead of speaking of strategy or goals, she spoke of values, of the importance of empathy, of resilience in the face of adversity, and, most importantly, the strength that comes from being true to oneself. "I didn't get here because of the clothes I wore or the position I held," Clara told them softly, her voice steady. "I got here because I believe in doing the right thing. I believe in being kind and hardworking, no matter what anyone thinks of me." Her words resonated deeply with her colleagues, many of whom had never truly understood what made Clara stand out. But in that moment they did. They understood that leadership wasn't about power. It was about the ability to inspire, to uplift, and to bring people together. Clara had shown them that it wasn't about where you started, but how you chose to move forward, and the integrity with which you carried yourself. As she finished her talk, Clara didn't wait for applause. She simply smiled, nodding to the team she had built and now led. She knew that their respect and the work they were all doing together was enough. In the years that followed, the company continued to thrive. Clara's leadership style became a model for others, and her story was passed down through the office like a quiet legend. When new employees asked about Clara, they were always told the same thing: "She's the heart of this place." And so, the legacy of the cleaning lady in cheap clothes lived on, an enduring reminder that appearances could never define a person's worth, and that true greatness often comes from the most unexpected places.